I didn't want to be there, honestly. But sometimes, life doesn't give you a choice. Try saying no when you're standing in front of three guys who don't know fear, don't know doubt. One of them is your older brother. We stood outside the big Victorian house on the outskirts of town. Old, worn by time, its paint peeling, its windows like blind eyes. Rumor had it the owners had left long ago, leaving behind nothing but dust and silence. They were rich, people said. They had a safe full of cash, jewelry, valuables, easy pickings. In and out, quick, Trevor, one of my brother's friends, whispered. No one will ever know. I swallowed hard. Everything inside me screamed that this was a bad idea. But I was the youngest, the weakest. If I turned around and tried to leave, they wouldn't let me. Lucas, the biggest of us, swung a crowbar at the lock, a sharp crack. The door creaked open, slow and heavy, like the house was exhaling, letting us in. We stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, old wood, and something else. Something sickly sweet, rotting, clinging to my skin like a dead animal's breath in the summer heat. Split up, my brother Ethan whispered. The faster we find the goods, the faster we're out. I nodded and headed toward the kitchen. Everything was in place. Dirty dishes sat in the sink, as if the owners had just finished eating and stepped out for a moment. A note lay on the table, written in shaky handwriting. We are still here. I froze. Guys, I started, but I didn't get to finish. A loud crash from upstairs, a scream, a gunshot. I ran up the stairs, taking two at a time. Trevor stood at the end of the hallway, chest heaving, pistol shaking in his grip. On the floor in front of him was a man, blood pooled beneath his body, dark and thick. He came at me, Trevor whispered. I didn't mean to. And then we heard it. A child's cry. The sound sent ice through my veins. Shit, someone's still here, Lucas muttered, stepping toward a door. I tried to stop him, but he had already pushed it open. Inside stood a woman, thin, terrified, clutching a baby to her chest. Please, she whispered. Lucas pulled out his knife. I closed my eyes. When it was over, I didn't feel alive anymore. We burned the house down. It's better this way, Ethan said. No one will ever know. We just have to forget. But forgetting wasn't an option, because they never left. At first it was small things. When I came home, my apartment smelled of smoke. I scrubbed everything, threw out my clothes, but the scent wouldn't go away. It had soaked into the walls, the furniture, my skin. Then the dreams started. I stood before the house, but it wasn't burned. It stood whole, untouched, and shadows moved behind the windows. They called my name. At night, I heard footsteps in my hallway, floorboards creaking, a whisper of fabric, slow, heavy breathing. Once I threw open my door, but the hallway was empty. Trevor called me at 3 a.m. They're watching me, he whispered. I see their reflections in windows, in mirrors, but when I turn around, no one's there. The next morning, he jumped from his apartment window. Then Lucas, he became obsessed, said he heard crying, saw smoke. One night, he locked himself in his bathroom. When they found him, he was sitting on the floor, carving something into the wall with a knife. I'm sorry. Then he stabbed himself in the heart. That left just Ethan and me. He came to my place one night. They're here, he said. They're standing behind you. I turned. Nothing. Ethan smiled. They're waiting for me. I couldn't stop him. That night, he set fire to his house with himself inside. Now, I'm the only one left. Every night, they come for me. First, the man. His chest is a black, gaping wound, his eyes filled with silent accusation. Then the woman. She holds the baby, and her lips move in a whisper. "You're the last one." I don't want to sleep, but I know they're coming.
My name is Emily, and I don't remember when it all began. It started with a shadow. Strange and indistinct, it flickered outside my windows, moved through my house, slipped into places where no one should be. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But with every passing day, that shadow grew more real, more solid, and the air around me grew heavier, as though it was thick with stale moisture. At first, I could still go out into the garden. The light breeze would carry the smell of freshly cut grass, and the flowers would exude the familiar fragrance of my childhood. But one day, as I stepped outside, I felt something strange, an unease. It was like the air itself had changed, and I wasn't alone. I looked around but saw nothing. Still, something in my gut told me I was being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling. From that moment on, I never ventured outside again. Fear had a firm grip on me, an irrational yet persistent thought that something was lurking just out of sight. I began to retreat further into the house. At first, I stayed in the living room, hoping that by being close to the windows, I could control my fears by seeing what was outside. But even here, I wasn't safe. I could feel the darkness closing in, lurking in the corners of the room, where the light couldn't reach. The eyes, I couldn't forget them. They were everywhere. In the mirror, in the reflection in the window, in the polished surfaces of furniture. It was always there, watching. Each day, my house became more and more strange. I would hear footsteps in the hallway, so clear that my heart would skip a beat. Sometimes the footsteps would grow quieter, but I could still sense them getting closer. I didn't know who or what it was. My mind fought against it, telling me it was just hallucinations. But my instincts told me otherwise. Each night, the darkness grew thicker, and I would huddle in bed, clutching my blankets, terrified to open my eyes. Sometimes, barely asleep, I would wake up to an unexplainable rustling sound, and every time, it grew clearer and more unbearable. It wasn't just a sound. It was as though the very air vibrated with its weight, as if something enormous was crawling along the floor. I'd turn around, but in the mirror there was nothing. The darkness would return, as if it swallowed the light. I knew he was coming. Eventually, I stayed in my room more and more. The walls seemed to close in on me, leaving no room for air to breathe. I could feel the shadow tightening around me. Something was creeping closer. I knew it. I could hear it slithering through the walls, the floors, the very foundation of my house. I could feel it. One night, I was in the bathroom when I heard the steps. Not just any steps, but heavy, earth-shaking steps that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. I looked around but saw nothing. The fear settled in my chest, squeezing my breath out. The air became thick and suffocating. I could feel the presence right outside the door. It was getting closer. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in terror. My breath was shallow, and my mind was racing. But all I could think about was the black, suffocating shape that was coming for me. There was nowhere to run, no escape. I was trapped. And then, without warning, I opened my eyes. The light was harsh, blinding. I tried to focus, but my vision swam. I felt something cold beneath me, something unfamiliar. It was hard. The sensation was wrong. I tried to move, but my arms wouldn't cooperate. They were strapped down? My heart began to pound as confusion filled my mind. Where was I? Why couldn't I move? I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The walls were white, sterile, but unfamiliar. The air smelled of antiseptic, of something clinical and cold. I couldn't remember how I got here. This place, it was like a hospital, but it didn't feel right. Panic surged through me as I struggled to recall what happened. How did I get here? The room felt so foreign, so distant from my home. I was lying in a bed, but the atmosphere was suffocating. My breath quickened as I glanced at the people standing around me. Doctors, nurses. Their faces held a strange, distant look, as though they were trying to understand what was wrong with me. But there was something unsettling about them. They were watching me, but not in the way I wanted them to. And then, as I lay there, still trying to make sense of everything, I turned my head. In the far corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, I saw it. The figure. It stood tall, its shape looming in the darkness, its form flickering, as if it were made of smoke or some dark mist. Its face was a twisted skeletal horror, its eyes empty black pits, its mouth open in a grotesque grin. Its body was covered in a slick, foul-smelling slime that dripped from its elongated limbs. I could smell it, a rancid, decaying stench that filled the air and made me want to gag. It was there, watching me. No, it couldn't be. This couldn't be real. I closed my eyes, hoping it would go away. But when I opened them again, it was still there, standing in the shadows, its eyes burning into mine. Its voice, low, guttural, and filled with malice, whispered through the room. "You think it's over? It's only just begun." My heart stopped. The fear surged through me, choking me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I was paralyzed by terror. And as I stared at the creature, I realized that no matter where I was, no matter how much time had passed, it would never leave me. It had always been here. It had never really gone.
Little Sam stood by the door, nervously tugging at the hem of his shirt. Something stirred behind the glass door, and he could feel his heart beating faster than usual. He stood in the dark corridor, glancing at the dark corners where someone might be hiding. Maybe he could wait until tomorrow. No, he couldn't wait. He knew this was important, that he wouldn't be able to calm down until he got what he wanted. His legs didn't obey him when he stepped forward and knocked on the door. "Come in." The voice was deep, like it came from some faraway dungeon, and it seemed like there was something hidden in it. The sardonic smile on his father's lips when he opened the door made Sam feel strangely uneasy. He raised his hand, and the door creaked open, as if something invisible was holding it in constant tension. He stepped into the brightly lit room, filled with the smell of tobacco smoke, old books, and something else. Something indefinable that made him feel awkward. In the far corner, behind a heavy wooden desk, sat his father. His face was hidden in shadows, but Sam could still feel his gaze like a cold hand on his neck. He glanced at the papers, paying no special attention to him. "I want a dog." Sam's voice was clear, more certain than ever before. He knew this would be a hard challenge, but he couldn't wait any longer. His father put down the pen, sighed heavily, and their eyes met. It was the same look he had seen many times before. "Sam, what did we talk about last time?" Sam froze, remembering the recent story about the goldfish, the one that died in the aquarium after he forgot to feed it. Tears were barely held back by his willpower. "You said I wasn't ready, that I wasn't responsible." His voice was barely audible. His father nodded. "If you couldn't take care of the fish, How can you take care of a dog? You need to prove that you are responsible." Sam looked at him, not understanding how something as simple as a dog could depend on this. I'll manage. Shh." His eyes burned with determination. "All right," his father sighed. 2 months. You'll do everything I tell you without reminders. Can you handle that?" His heart opened as soon as he heard the promise. He would finally get what he wanted. He nodded. It was simple. 2 months passed quickly. His life gradually began to fall into perfect order. He woke up in the mornings, packed his bag, put food in the box, and his efforts seemed unwavering. He made almost no mistakes, except for that one attempt to make peanut butter with a hammer and nuts. His father looked at him with disapproval but remained silent, occasionally frowning slightly. He still hid his face. "Dad, Dad, Dad," he shouted one day, barely waiting until the last week was over. "Yes," his father replied, not looking up from his papers. 2 months are over. I've done everything." "So what?" He turned in his chair and lifted his gaze, full of sarcasm. "Well, I've done everything." He fell silent and turned his gaze away. All right. But you understand that in this house, there is always room for improvement, right?" His face paled, and he was ready to cry. But his father laughed, and that laugh made something inside him turn cold. "Oh, you're absolutely right. You're going to have some fun. How about the dog?" "Let's go," he said, as if nothing had happened. His voice became calmer, soothing. They descended the stairs into the basement where a sign read, "Kennel." Sam immediately sensed the smell. It was strange, thick, and painful, like an unbearable mix of dampness and something rotting. He didn't notice how the air became colder and heavier. He walked ahead, his small legs struggling to keep up with his father. His father opened the door, and immediately a sharp sound hit his face, barking. A multitude of barks. But this wasn't joyful barking. It was something else. Ominous, filled with despair and hunger. They walked through the dark corridors, and the further they went, the worse the smell became. The images in Sam's mind began to crumble, like dust from an old book. Gray faces, distorted, with clipped claws that hadn't yet become real animals. Are these dogs?" His voice barely came out as he touched the cages, in which there were not quite dogs. "Yes, these are dogs," his father said, not meeting his gaze. "But you see, they're a bit unusual." A remote control appeared in his hands. He pressed a button, and from the cage, which had just been making weak moaning sounds, came screams of pain and horror. Then silence. Sam stepped back, shaken, but couldn't understand why it felt so terrifying. The sorrowful eyes that didn't belong to any animal. "Dad, this isn't a dog," he whispered faintly, but his father stopped. "You want a dog, right? This is your dog, and if it's not obedient, you know what will happen." Sam, trembling, grabbed the first leash that came to hand. The basement's darkness closed in around him, and the stench of decay, blood, and wet fur became unbearable. He couldn't see which creature he had chosen, but the metal ring in his small fingers felt ice cold. His father silently watched him from the shadows. "Are you sure?" His voice was muffled, almost with a hint of pleasure. Sam didn't answer. He just wanted to leave this place. His new pet made a wet scraping sound, like either a groan or a growl. His father swung open the heavy door, releasing them from the basement. As soon as Sam stepped into the brightly lit hallway, his feet froze to the floor. The creature he had chosen was huge, unevenly sewn together, as if assembled from parts of different beings. Its body was covered in patches of black, matted fur, and in places the skin was stretched so tightly that the seams were tearing, exposing damp, bleeding muscles. Its face, number. This was not a dog's face. In the half-light of the hallway, Sam saw human eyes. They burned in this beastly face, gleaming with pain and awareness. The creature's lips were cut, as if someone had tried to carve a dog's mouth but hadn't succeeded completely. Its throat emitted intermittent, convulsive sobs. The creature tugged at the leash, but not toward the door. It was reaching out to him. "This isn't a dog," Sam croaked, taking a step back. "Of course, it's a dog," his father said gently. He turned to him and felt the blood drain from his face. His father was smiling. His face, it seemed to melt. The skin on his cheeks wrinkled, and something moved beneath it. His lips stretched into an unnaturally wide grin, revealing an uneven row of teeth. The whites of his eyes had almost disappeared, leaving only huge pupils. "You really wanted a dog, Sam?" he whispered, taking a step toward him. "We all wanted it." And in that moment, everything inside Sam tore apart. Voices, screaming, darkness. He remembered this wasn't his father. He didn't know where he was. Memories flashed before him like a torn film. He had been standing in front of a pet store window. It was evening. He wanted a puppy. Something grabbed him from behind. Then pain, then darkness. Sam screamed and ran away, but there was no door. Only the endless corridor stretching deep into the house, its walls trembling as if they were alive. The stench of flesh and blood grew stronger. Behind him, claws scraped across the floor. Sam. The creature to which the leash was attached croaked. "Sam." His father's voice echoed, now not alone. From all sides, voices echoed from the darkness. And they were calling him.